I'm going to cover some of the important information that you need to know regarding general dive skills and the environment, the dive environment, that will help you in your PADI Dive Master exam and certainly in your instructor exam. So this is a pretty focused presentation, giving you not too much unnecessary information and trying to help you with videos and other things. Remember the important stuff you need to remember to pass these exams. I'm going to look at tides, currents, waves, rip currents, altitude diving, distance estimation, and lift backs. In this video, I'm only going to be looking at tides. There's enough information to discuss on tides to take an entire video. They're primarily caused by the gravitational pull of the moon, in fact. The sun, though, does have some influence, so very often you'll find in PADI exams questions about what causes tides. The correct answer is usually the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon. If it just says the moon, that would also be a good answer. What is the most significant cause is definitely the moon. This is quite a cool video that I found explains how the moon influences tides and explains it better than I could. I found it on YouTube. I edited it slightly to keep it relevant to what's going to come up in your exams, and it's from a guy called Stephen Saunders.
Why do we have tides, and why are they caused by the moon? Most people can tell me that tides they're caused by the moon, right? Well, why? Even if I asked what about the moon, people would tell me it's gravity, which is correct, but then what about the sun? Isn't the sun like a lot bigger and thus has a lot more gravity? So why does the moon affect us more than the sun when it comes to tides? Let's take a look. So the moon causes tides because of the moon's differential gravitational force. What? So differential gravitational force, it's not that bad. All it means is that the moon pulls on the Earth differently. So the moon is closer to this side of the Earth right here in the front, right? So it's going to pull on that actually 6% more than the back side of the Earth, because it's actually farther away from the moon. Gravity is a force, and it acts as you get farther away from it. It doesn't, you know, the strength isn't as strong. So the stuff on the front side of the Earth here gets pulled on the moon 6% more than this side. Now the sun is really far away, and it doesn't see us as well. It does have differential gravitational force, but it basically treats the Earth as a point source. Not completely. That's how we get spring and neap tides. I'm not going to go into that. Maybe in another blog. But the sun, because it's so far away, doesn't exhibit as strong of differential gravitational force as the moon does. And it's going to help us understand tides. I can move the moon. I can change its orbit. I can do all kinds of fun stuff. Now, we need to know what the Earth is feeling at any given point on the surface. Now, that's pretty cool. So, judging by this, I have high tide. I have a high tide that's not as high, but it's a high tide. And then I have low tide and low tide. Let me put some more on. Now, here's what's really cool. So you can actually see the ebb and flow of the water. So, as the moon goes around us, you can actually see why differential gravitational force makes tides. So this part's feeling a pretty strong tug, and this part's actually feeling a strange tug, and these guys are being pulled in. And that's differential gravitational force in a nutshell. Pretty awesome program, if you ask me. You can see, like, you know, end of the world, kind of, you know, the moon. That's awesome. So the next time you're at the beach, look for the moon, and you'll be able to tell what tide it is. If you see the moon directly over the, you know, it doesn't matter what phase it is. It depends on where it is compared to you on the Earth. So if you're looking directly overhead and you see the moon, say you see the first quarter moon and it's over your head, well, that's when the moon is closest to your part of the Earth, when it's due south. So you're going to have high tide. If you see the moon on the horizon, that's when it's actually not, you know, that's when the moon is moved off and it's at that 90-degree angle, and you're going to have remember the 2 arrows are pointing in, and that's where low tide was. So when you see the moon on the horizon, you have low tide. If you don't see the moon at all, well, maybe it's directly underneath your feet, and that could be another high tide, but it'd be a little tricky. But if you can see the moon, you can tell, you know, if you see it on the horizon and it's getting higher in the sky, you're going to be going into high tide. That's kind of cool. And if it's above your head and it's starting to go down, then you're going into low tide. Hope you enjoyed the lesson on the tides. and differential gravitational force.
It is largely the moon that determines the time of day we have high and low tide, is what we have now learnt. The sun's main impact is how high or low the tide is, because its gravitational pull is either going to assist the gravitational pull of the moon, they're going to work together, or it could actually counter the moon's influence and actually reduce some of the gravitational pull of the moon. And that all depends on where the sun and the moon are in relation to each other, which is, of course, why we have different phases of the moon and different phases of tide, spring tides and neap tides, which is what we're going to see another video, again a video aimed at a fairly young audience, but it does actually do a reasonably good job of explaining a little bit more about tides and getting more into spring and neap tides.
There's a lot of factors involved in creating the tides here on Earth, but the big three are the moon, the sun, and the Earth. The gravitational pull of all three of those bodies interacting creates the tides. The biggest factor actually is the moon. It exerts about 2.2 times more power on the tides than the sun does. So for once, the moon gets to one-up the sun. It's kind of a big deal to it. Imagine for our purposes the Earth is right here and the moon is directly above it. Now, they exert a gravitational pull on one another, and since on the Earth most things are pinned down, we have shoes, buildings have foundations, stuff stays in place. But the oceans, being literally fluid, actually can be pulled toward the moon, and this is what creates the tide. The moon's here, it's pulling on the ocean at the top of the Earth, creating a high tide on the top. Now on the bottom, another high tide is created because the Earth itself is pulled toward the moon, even though the oceans down here have less gravitational pull exerted on them, being farthest away from the moon. So on the top and bottom, you have high tide because of the tidal bulges, and on the sides that are at right angles to the moon, you have low tide because the oceans stretch thin over the surface of the Earth. Pretty crazy, huh? So, like I said, the sun also exerts an influence on the tides, but it's less pronounced than the moon's. See, it actually enhances or diminishes the gravitational pull of the moon here on Earth. When the sun and the moon are in alignment, the sun enhances the moon's gravitational pull, creating higher tides than normal. They're called spring tides, and they happen on a full moon or a new moon. Now, when the sun and the moon are at right angles to one another, with the Earth right about here, the sun diminishes the gravitational pull of the moon on Earth, creating lower than normal high tides, also called neap tides. These happen on the quarter moons. Because the Earth and the moon are constantly moving and moving around one another, there's a constant movement from high tide to low tide. Twice a day, you get a high tide in most places, usually once every 12 hours and 25 minutes. But this can vary, and some places only see a high tide once every 24 hours. Those are called diurnal tides. So this is a daily occurrence, actually twice daily in most places.
I didn't fully agree with some of the reasoning in that video. Seems a little bit odd to me, but I do actually think it did a pretty good job of graphically illustrating how the sun and the moon can affect the tides. We hopefully now understand the timing of the tide is based on the moon's position in relation to us, and the spring and neap tides, how high or how low the tides are, is determined by the sun and the moon's relation to each other. You may well get a question talking about the range of the tide. So it's going to be important to understand what is meant by the range of the tide in a PADI question. We've already talked about the fact that at certain times of the month in places, or pretty much everywhere, at certain times of the month, high tide is much higher than at other times of the month, and low tide is much lower than at other times in the month, and those are called spring and neap tides. Now, we also need to realize that geographically around the world, the highest high tide can be much lower in some places than the highest high tide in other places. And that's what we're really meaning when we say the range of the tide. So what is it that causes high tide to be higher in some places than it is in others? The range of the tide is the difference between high and low tide. For example, you may well know that in the Caribbean and the Mediterranean, the difference between high and low tide at any point in the lunar cycle is not actually very great. In other areas, such as Canada, the Bay of Fundy, at some times of year, the difference between high and low tide can be as much as 16.3 meters, taller than a 3-story building. And that is because of the topography of the area. I'm going to try and explain this and show how topography affects tides. Firstly, let's understand some definitions here. We have a tidal graph here. We have the time on the bottom, so let's say we have a high tide at 6 AM. That might be when the moon is directly overhead. We have a low tide, let's say that's 6 hours later, so 12 PM. And that would be when the moon was on the horizon at a 90-degree angle to us. And then we might have another high tide. This is the most normal situation in most places around the world, approximately 12 hours later, maybe 6 PM. And that would be when the moon was on the exact opposite side of the Earth. The difference between spring tide and neap tide is what I'm trying to draw in on this tidal chart right now. And we now know that the sun is what causes this difference. Or at least it's the relative position of the sun and the moon that determines whether the high tide is very high in any given location or very low in any given location. And what we're really wanting to talk about now is the range of the tide. So these lines here are trying to illustrate that. The difference between high tide and low tide in terms of meters or feet is the range of the tide. So this is the range of the tide when we're in a situation when we have spring tides, and that is determined by topography. The difference between high tide and low tide in one place could be many meters. The difference between high tide and low tide in another place may be only centimeters, and that is all going to be determined on where you are geographically and the topography in that area. Now we're looking at the range of the neap tides, and that pretty much is what we need to now make sure we understand how topography plays a part. I want you to imagine that the line we are seeing moving across the Atlantic Ocean here is the high tide. It is where the moon is directly over that part of the ocean. And now, as it's approaching the coastline of England and Wales, we need to focus in on the shape of the coastline. What we can see is that this big bulge of water is actually going to be moving into an almost funnel shaped area of coastline, and that large bulge of water is getting pushed into a narrower and narrower and narrower inlet, the Bristol Channel. And at the end of this funnel you can expect the high tide, because of this huge bulge of water that's been pushed in, to be much higher than in another area where the bulge of water is not being funneled by the coastline in the way that we can see the coastline would actually funnel and compress the high tide as it moved in this particular area. And this particular area is an area where you see some huge tidal extremes. The shape of the coastline, or the topography, is what is playing a part in how high up the high tide is and how big a range of tide you see. For example, in Cardiff, when you look at tide charts for Cardiff, which is located right there, you will see that it's over 40 feet of difference between high and low tide, a massive range in the tide. Whereas just a very small number of miles away, in Swanage, you have a completely different tidal range, because that is not located at the end of a funnel-shaped coastline. The topography of how the water is pushed towards Swanage is very, very different. It's not at the end of a funnel, and we're looking at a tidal range of only around 5 feet in that particular location. The Mediterranean Sea is a place that has a very, very small rise and fall of the tide, or range of tide. The difference between high tide and low tide in the Mediterranean is minuscule. If you look at the top left hand corner of the picture, that's the Straits of Gibraltar, and that is the only place that water can flow into or out of the Mediterranean as the tide rises and falls. And that's such a small gap compared to the size of the sea that you see almost zero rise and fall of the tide in the Mediterranean. In fact, the sunlight working on that large sea is evaporating large amounts of water, and there is actually a constant inflow of water through the Straits of Gibraltar, regardless of the tide. And that is why we see very little tidal rise and fall in the Mediterranean. The topography of the area, there's very little opportunity for water to flow in and out. Many people think for a very small tidal rise and fall in the Caribbean is because it's close to the equator, and that has got absolutely nothing to do with it at all. The reason that there isn't a very large tidal rise and fall in the Caribbean is again to do with the shape of the land masses and the topography there. If you actually imagine that large bulge of water that the moon is sort of pulling around the Earth almost, what you realize is that you've got a large chain of islands that are significantly Cuba, for example, and the Dominican Republic and the Lesser Antilles. They are significantly hampering the volume of water that could flow out of the Caribbean Sea. And then, of course, on the other side, you've actually got the American continent. So a very limited opportunity for water to flow in and out on every 6 hours. So the topography here is also what is causing there to be a very small difference between high tide and low tide. The other word for that, a very small tidal range. For example, here on the east coast of Panama, you have only a minor tidal range of around 2 feet. Yet if you were to look at one of the ports on the west coast of Panama, you have a very, very different tidal range, and there again, there are two locations that are very, very close to each other geographically, but the topography of surrounding them and the ability of that tidal bulge to move in, for water to flow in and out without being impeded, is what is causing the differences. On the west coast, you've got an 18-foot tidal range. And if we look a little bit more closely at that topography over on the west coast of Panama, once again we can see a similar funnel shape there. You can imagine that tidal bulge coming across the Pacific Ocean, and you can see very, very clearly how that tidal bulge is being pushed by sort of a funnel shape of the landmass, and it's getting pushed into a narrower and narrower area, causing a much more significant high and low tide or tidal range. There is another type of topography that you might also want to consider, and that is the topography of the actual beach, maybe. We've got a very steep beach on the left and a very flat beach on the right. So if a if you had a high tide of 1 meter or a tidal range of 1 meter in this particular geographical location, let's imagine that these two beaches are right next to each other, maybe on opposite sides of a narrow peninsula. That tidal rise and fall of 1 meter or 10 meters, whatever it might be, you would obviously see the water going much further up and down the beach on the flat beach than on the steep beach. So that is another way to think about how topography might affect your experience of a tide. Now, whether that's really tidal range, the range that it's going up the beach, is the distance that the water moves up a beach compared to high tide and low tide, the tidal range, I would argue that no, it's not. That's not what we mean by tidal range. But it is maybe, these two images are maybe a good way to help you get in your head that when we're thinking tidal range, we're thinking topography. Because you are going to get PADI questions that ask about tidal range, and it's when you see the word range in the question, you need to think, well, topography is a factor. The sun and the moon are the primary influencers of tides, and how high tides go, and how low tides go, and when the high tide is. But topography plays a part and influences the range of the tide. That concludes video 1 in the dive skills and the environment section. All my dive theory videos are located on my website, and it's there that you will find them ordered in the most logical manner, very nicely organized with lots of written notes to assist you in mastering this topic and excelling in your dive master and instructor exams. If you're sharing the details of this video online, please post links to my website, www.goprocaribbean.com/divetheory. That way you're going to be helping people find the videos in the area where they will most benefit from them and be able to follow them in the most logical order.